I'm beginning the theme for this month. This is my first presentation. It's going to be focusing on a group of people, those who believe, do righteous deeds, they advise each other to truth or enjoin each other to truth and enjoin each other to patience. Verily, mankind is at loss. So here it says, by time. Again, it helps to look at more than one translation. Consider the flight of time. Verily, man is bound to lose himself. Mankind faces loss. Unless he be of those who attain to faith, do good works, enjoin one upon another, keeping to truth, enjoin one upon another, doing, to patience during adversity. It helps. It's a short chapter. We could look at another translation to get a more in-depth meaning of it. By the token of time, through the ages, verily man is in loss, except such as have faith, do righteous deeds, join together in mutual teaching of truth and of patience and constancy. So I want to take us into this chapter. In the last theme, I was focused on those groups who were not enjoining each other to truth or faith, or enjoining each other to patience and constancy. So let me look at a post I wrote about 6 some years ago. Praising God in difficult times. People are of 2 types. They are either your brothers in faith or your brothers in humanity. And this was by one of the companions, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Co-worker mentioned to me at the time that some official claimed God spoke to him directly and directed him how to make changes to the laws of our country. I couldn't verify the claim, but I explained that as a Muslim, the Quran instructs us to ask for evidence behind such claims. You can't just say, God chose me. You have to present evidence that God chose you. It has to be evidence that we can verify, clarify, confirm that indeed you were chosen. And this is the difference between Antichrist when they arise versus the real Christ, on in peace, when he returns. Is they always come through enjoining truth, enjoining patience, enjoining, promoting clarity, promoting verification, promoting confirmation. So you will see that also throughout the prophets' lives. Prophets and messengers were established with proof as being sent and directed by God. They didn't just come, land in the mid-town center and start saying, I am a prophet, you have to believe me or you're going to hell. They didn't compel anyone to these truths. They came with proofs that people can clarify. It's clear as day, as open as day, that they were sent on a mission by God. Neither should I or anyone be compelled by a person's personal experience with God, nor should anyone be compelled with my personal reflections of faith. They are mine, and I share them for others to investigate and take what they find of benefit and disregard otherwise. Now, I have mentioned more than once, and this is why I like the poetry by Shakespeare on the abuse of power. I mentioned that more than once, that the abuse of power disjoins remorse from power. And if you notice abusive, powerful people, those who are abusive, there is no remorse. You could see that if you just watch them and how they speak. When they do something wrong, there is literally zero remorse for the actions that they partake in. But if you look even deeper at their journey, you will see it's a rags to riches story. You'll always see them rags to riches. Why this is important? Because sometimes people in our community also, maybe out of, ignorance, but they tend to present the prophets and messengers that way, which is not true. The prophet and messengers came from the top and were brought down. That's part of the proof manifested to everybody that these are prophets and messengers of God. They were brought to ground zero. They faced so much trials and tribulations that had we faced these trials and tribulations, we would not be able to function, neither mentally, emotionally, even spiritually, given the trials and tribulations that the prophets had and messengers had faced. They didn't compel anyone to these truths. Neither should I or anyone be compelled by a person's personal experience with God. nor should anyone be compelled with my personal reflections of faith. They are mine. I share them for others to investigate and take what they find of benefit and disregard otherwise. Just want to make sure that I am sharing the correct part of the screen. I need to check to see. Turn settings. Sharing this. See, sharing this part. I just want to make sure I'm sharing the screen because it appeared like I wasn't. In any case, if it goes from the top, they come to ground zero. Many of us, like I said, we would not be functioning if we went from the top to ground zero. Now, people always see, humility, the manifestation of their humility as a negative thing. But you can't receive from God unless you're at a particular position, a particular state. Now, they're always humble. They were humble at the top, but they're coming to the bottom, coming to ground zero, not in the eyes of God, in the eyes of humanity, where that group that they belong to had many forces that were not functioning, enjoining each other to truth, enjoining each other to patience, doing good work. So it was a system that was not operating for the health of the community, the health of the group. So when they start to speak and they start to enjoin truth, what happens is they start to then face all sorts of enemies upon enemies upon enemies upon enemies until they hit, ground zero. And this becomes a manifestation of their humility because they're still calling to truth, still calling to patience. So imagine, for example, Prophet Abraham, upon him peace, what he faced, and then he had to be exiled, and he had to be exiled again. And, the having to be, in a particular, group, and then to be all the way alone and living as a form. And God calls him, an ummah by himself. So this is, mankind isn't lost, except those who enjoin each other to truth, except those who enjoin each other to patience. So as I mentioned at the time, however, I see it both ways or more. As a Muslim living in the West and belonging to a minority group, I see groups from all directions seeking to control the will of others, obligating people to their beliefs or worldview, justifying discrimination, abuse, disrespect, as well as scapegoating others. They don't know how to give advice in good faith, establish healthy boundaries with those they passionately disagree with, or respect people who do not share their worldview. No one is asking you to marry them, just respect them as human beings, recipients of the divine breath. You do not have to respect their ideas or personal experiences. Instead, they literally justify for themselves all sorts of abuse while claiming to be fighting abuse and discrimination. So I want to begin here with we're transitioning from the other theme to this theme. Other theme was speaking about an unhealthy group. And this theme will be about the healthy group that enjoins each other to truth and patience. So Ibn Abbas, narrated from Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings. When you go to a powerful ruler and fear that he will attack you, notice how the leader of the group law is greater. Say it to yourself, law is greater, law is mightier. You're not saying it, by the way, to the person. You're not going to go to the person and say, law is greater, law is mightier. You're saying it to yourself because you're nurturing yourself because this person is threatening and he's showing you his power. He wants to destroy you. Allah is greater, Allah is mightier than all his creation. Allah is greater than all that is feared and all that you are wary of. I seek refuge with Allah. There is no God but him, the one who keeps the 7 heavens from falling onto the earth by nothing except his permission. Because an abuse of power will showcase their power. So it helps sometimes to look at the cosmos to see who's really in power. Similar to kind of like Abraham, upon him peace, when he faced the tyrant, and the tyrant showed him, like the power that he has. So he says, well, can you rearrange, and I'm paraphrasing here, the cosmos? So it's kind of the same spirit. Always center yourself with who has power, because they will huff and puff and show, look at how much power we have. And you have to center yourself that God is the one who keeps the seven heavens from falling onto the earth by nothing except his permission. So you seek protection from the evil of your servants. So and so mention the names, their armies, their followers, their supporters, both among jinn and men. And notice here is birds of a feather flock together. So amongst this group, because they're not enjoining each other the truth, they're not enjoining each other the patience, are jinn, are Satans. They're in their company. O Allah, be my protector against their evil. Your praise is great. Your protection is immense. Blessed is your name. There is no God but you. So say it 3 times, couple it with saying peace and blessings upon Prophet Muhammad. Now, you can't just focus outward, because speaking truth to power, it's an outward and inward process. You don't just kind of go to the tyrant and just say, you're this, you have to, before you say anything to them, you should first say it to yourself. And it helps to go through this prayers for forgiveness. Because the tyrant, in reality, the reason they're trying to dominate you, it goes into, again, that Shakespeare's poetry, if you walk with me to that poetry, they're starting at the bottom. They come from a low nature. And they have a low opinion of themselves. Why? Because they absorb the dominant voice of themselves. So they have a low opinion of themselves. They're not concerned about what God knows of themselves. They're worried about what others think of them. And so that's how that dominant voice becomes their voice. And so they start to seek their approval. They start to seek to impress them. But it becomes, again, they start off with that. They go from a rags to riches journey. It's not the other way, the way the prophets and messengers. It's the rags to riches. So here they start with a low opinion of themselves. And why? Because they have made the dominant voice, the voice of oppression, their voice. If you consider the story of Joseph, upon him peace, he refused to allow the dominant voice to be his voice. He refused. Moses refused the dominant voice to be his voice. So what happens with this group, how it forms, is that it begins with there is a dominant voice that is at loss, and it becomes the dominant voice of the group that is weak. They're not really enjoining each other the truth. They're not joining each other to patience. They're really focused on that this dominant voice is making them feel low in their eyes. And so they're climbing this ladder to be great in their eyes and the eyes of people. That's what happened to Zionists. They are trying to climb that ladder to be great in their eyes and in their eyes of people. So if you listen to them, they literally they're telling on themselves. They're saying, look at us now, we're great, we have power, they're not concerned at all about what God knows, what they're doing, what actions they're engaged in. They're mainly cloaked in what they view themselves and what others, the dominant voice, views them. They don't care about actions that kill the heart. They don't care about these actions. Their main concern is here. The dominant voice in Europe made them feel low. Instead of safeguarding their heart, they took that dominant voice, became their voice. Instead of doing like Joseph, upon him peace, refusing that distorted voice, they turned around and they actually internalized it, and they had that internal collapse. Let's walk through that. Psychology, communication, and studies all show that harsh inner voices can come from many sources, including public groups, signing, group behavior to parents. Some individuals do that, is not insight. It's misattribution. When someone tries to invalidate you, if we look at it, just look at the facts, say like the let's go to Europe, and they're trying to invalidate a particular group or destabilize you or turn the tables on everything you say. The heart needs grounding. It strengthens resistance by refusing to internalize that distortion. And it strengthens resilience by keeping you centered when others are unstable. So think of also Joseph in the kingdom. When there is that distortion and they want him to submit, she even used the word, Zulaykha, submit to her desires. If he doesn't, he'll be the lowest of the low. So again, the submission and the collapse come from fear. So he resists. And he shows resistance and resilience, knowing that Allah is greater and not worrying about what is the definition of low or lowest in her eyes, but what it is in God's eyes. So he refuses that distortion. But where did that distortion come from? And the call to internalize that distortion come from? It came from Zulaykha and the kingdom, the dominant voice. Same thing in Europe. Where did that voice come from? For example, despised Jews. It came from Europe. There was a hatred of Jews in Europe. They also hated Muslims because they look at what happened in Bosnia. But again, it came from a dominant voice. And sometimes that dominant voice becomes your voice, that inner voice. But the way it comes out is you start to become a clone of that dominant voice. And you start to turn around, just like Shakespeare said, you get to the very top and you start to actually look at with disdain at a reflection of yourself, who you were in Europe. So if you notice, for example, Zionists have a hatred of weakness. If you notice how they mock and they ridicule the people in Gaza, they have a hatred of the fact that they're weak, that they don't have power, that they're not able to gain justice. Like they were laughing at what they were doing to them in Gaza. It was like their heart was killed, that they killed their heart. There was like no remorse, a total disconnect from 100 years ago, the story that they told about what they faced in Europe, a total disconnect on the similarity of what they're doing to people in Gaza. So this dua is not merely a plea for protection. It's a reorientation of the heart that produces moral courage in three profound ways. Relocates fear from people to God. That's what we saw that in Joseph. Instead of fearing, Zulaykha and a multiplication of that voice, that distorted voice, he feared God. So he centered God. He refused to internalize that distortion. Allah is greater. Allah is mightier than all his creation. Allah is more powerful than whatever I fear or worry about. This shifts the emotional center of gravity. That's what we're supposed to be taking from that story. Instead of fearing someone's anger, someone's narrative, someone's power, someone's manipulation, someone's instability, the heart is anchored in a higher, unshakable reality. So this is the foundation of moral courage. Fear is placed where it belongs, so it cannot be weaponized by others. Breaks the illusion of human power. The supplication that I mentioned to you by Ibn Abbas, that he narrated by Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings, names the other person as your servant. So the abusive power is still the servant of God. They're under his control. He's being tested. That group is being tested, surrounded by followers, soldiers, supporters. They're being tested with power. This reframes the entire dynamic. It reminds the heart, this person is not a giant. The circle is not an empire. It's a group they're joined together, not by truth, not by patience, not by faith, not by doing good deeds. They're joined together, again, through manipulation, dominance, humiliating others. It's all about, because they began at ground zero, having a low opinion of themselves, and they climbed to the top. And throughout that process, while they were climbing to the top, they disjoined remorse from power. So they were gaining power, and they were bypassing every single, you might say, like they were rationalizing their way to the top. Everything single call to stop, repent, make amends. They bypassed that and bypassed that and bypassed that. And they rationalized their way to get to the top such that they killed their heart. There's no remorse. And if you look at them, you'll see there's no remorse. If you look at the leaders attacking, people in Gaza, there's no remorse, correct? They got to the top. They say, we're at the top. Who can stop us? But what you see is also they have no remorse. But they started with a low opinion of themselves. And they internalize that distortion of the dominant voice. They internalize it. Unlike Joseph, who said, I am not going to accept that voice, they internalize, they absorb it. They became a sponge and absorbed it fully. This reframes the entire dynamic. It reminds the heart, this person is not a giant. This is the person who wants to resist that dominant voice. Their circle is not an empire. Their influence is not absolute, and their intimidation is not real authority. So now you have to form a group that sees it that way. But oftentimes groups look to power and they want to climb that steps to the top. And so it becomes hard to form a group that enjoins each other to truth, enjoins each other to patience. That's what the prophets face. Abraham couldn't find a group to enjoin each other truth and patience. He was an ummah by himself. Noah could only get 80 people to listen and say, resist. This is the reality. He called them to forgiveness, to seek forgiveness from God, because they absorbed that voice. They submitted to that distorted voice. Moses the same, even though they crossed the Red Sea, he was not successful in terms of getting them to come together to enjoin each other to truth, enjoin each other to patience. As soon as they were tested, what happens? They follow the Samari. It restores your agents and dignity. This dua doesn't ask for escape. It asks for protection, clarity, moral steadiness, divine companionship. It's a prayer for uprightness. I will stand my ground. If you could reflect here on Joseph, refusing to internalize that dominant voice and worry about, and refusing to have a low opinion, because he said, I will make you the lowest of the low. And he refused to internalize that distortion, refused to collapse under that pressure. Doesn't mean there aren't risks that will be taken, but that the resistance here is what I'm asking you to notice, and the resilience, holding your center, holding your truth. And that also has to take place with you not allowing your ego, because that's where the ego worries about what it thinks of itself. The soul worries about what God knows. So if it's trying to humiliate him, well, then the soul overpowers the ego. It can make those 70 prayers and turn to God. Let's go straight to God. Because you're worried about, it's not going to be hard for the soul to turn to God and seek mercy, seek forgiveness, stay centered with the truth, holding your truth, stay centered with God. Someone making you feel humiliated, that's your ego is worried about what you think or what other people think of you. The soul is worried about what God knows, what God sees. What connections this dua establishes and strengthens? This dua strengthens 3 essential connections that protect a person from manipulation, intimidation, and emotional destabilization. But just notice again, Joseph went from the top to ground zero. Moses went from the top to ground zero. But they resisted, and there was resilience as well as resistance to the distortion, the voice of distortion. It doesn't always come from parents. It comes from society, whoever it is that you have an awe of in your heart. Whoever it is you have an awe, then that voice becomes the center of your universe. And you start to absorb that voice, whatever they say, whatever they do, into your heart. Whatever they think, you absorb it into your heart. And for a parent, for example, I'll give you this example. Which one of us did not experience the I hate you, the child's, grandstand of I hate you. Every parent experiences that. So, and that's a test. It's also a test that That's okay for them to have these emotions and their feelings, but it's also a test who's the center of your universe. You have to check, is your child the center of your universe as well? You have to check to see, is that child? Well, you should really, if you're trying to please God, you make prayer and you make sure that you are doing what is pleasing to God. But if they have that I hate you moment, then take it as a test that every child has an I hate you moment with their parent. And we have discussions like earlier on, when we used to go to groups who talk about parenting, we would laugh, of course, when people realize that it wasn't just them, that everyone experiences that I hate you moment from a child, and you just check yourself and say, did I treat that child the way that is pleasing to God? And that's the way the soul takes over. And this is in reflection on Prophet, Jacob, because it's pretty hard to deal with a child where one set of children went ahead and put another child into the well. It can shake a person, make him question, did I raise them right? Did this happen? This happened. So in that case, you could see his voice was one of faith, but it did not become their inner voice. We know it became the inner voice of Joseph, because he says that, it says in if you study that journey, it says that he had a recollection of his father's voice when Zulaikha called him, and it became his inner voice, but it didn't become the inner voice of his other children. It was not their inner voice. So again, it's important for us not to generalize and make statements that may mislead and misguide others. Dua strengthens 3 essential connections that protect a person from manipulation, intimidation, and emotional destabilization. The heart connects to the reality that God is the only true source of power. Doesn't mean you pit yourself against the person or the evil person or the evil power. It just means that you don't allow, they're going through a test, you're going through a test, but you don't allow them to promote themselves through awe in your heart, where you're trying to impress abusive power. Human power is contingent and limited. No one can harm you outside God's permission. This connection dissolves fear-based submission. It strengthens resistance. I will not internalize your distortion. We can hear that in Joseph's journey. I will not internalize your distortion. Maybe not the exact words, but we could see how that resistance and that resilience took place. Just positions you as a moral actor. You can't call others to truth if you're not calling yourself to truth. Person with boundaries, someone who can stand upright, someone who can name harm, someone who can seek protection without shrinking. So this connection dissolves emotional collapse. Notice he didn't collapse. Joseph did not collapse when he was put in prison. I will not lose myself because of your instability. He recognized this is a group that is not stable, and he did not want to put himself in a group that was not stable and absorb that instability. Connection to reality, not illusion. Manipulative dynamics rely on inflated power, distorted narratives, emotional intimidation, symbolic gestures, triangulation, avoidance of accountability. And we saw that again in that group that I'm referring to. So this dua cuts through all of that. So the cure for such a group dynamic is the reverse. Instead of inflated power, or inflated ego, distorted narratives, here you're enjoining each other to truth. You don't want distorted narrative. You don't want emotional intimidation. You're enjoining each other to patience. You don't want to go intimidate somebody, like, I'm going to go in your face and show you I am here intimidating you. I'm going to rage bait you. You're not engaging in emotional intimidation. Joseph didn't go rage baiting people. I am going to triangulate you, and you're not really responding to abusive power with truth and patience and actions that push back that spirit. you're actually becoming destabilized and you're absorbing that distorted abuse of power within yourself. So that's why it's so many groups that have that distortion. It reconnects you to what is real, what is stable, what is unchanging, what is morally true. It protects you from internalizing, like I said, the distortion and losing your grounding. You're not at ground zero looking to the top. You're not, I have a low opinion of myself and I absorb the dominant view's opinion of me. And now I need to climb the ladder so that I can have an inflated, ego opinion of myself. And then the world can have that inflated opinion of me. Praise is accepted. Everything else is not. That's not what you are looking for. You're looking for nurturing people to truth, and truth is what's being elevated, and faith is what's being elevated, and the call to faith. And this is why the call to faith in Islam is you go on the minaret and then you call people to faith. So what is being elevated? The call to faith. Come to faith, come to prayer. What is being elevated? It's not your ego, it's the call to faith, the call to conscious, call to what brings the heart back to life. Strengthens resistance and it strengthens resilience. So this prayer, again, it nurtures moral courage by relocating fear from people to God, breaking the illusion of human power, and restoring your agency. It strengthens the inner connection that protects you from manipulation. Connection to God's power, connection to your moral agency, connection to reality. In doing so, it guards you from submission and collapse, and cultivates resistance and resilience. So again, you can't give out to others to form a group unless you have that same discussion with yourself. That's why I like these prayers. They're kind of in-depth, and they walk you through a lot of the rationalizations of the ego. And if you are not aware of how the ego is Satan's BFF, Satan only calls you to what's internal within you. So if you want to repel Satan, you want to make sure that the ego is always humbled. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because you want the soul, the call to faith, to be elevated. It should be the one kind of like holding the reins of what drives you. So by going through and repelling these rationalizations of the ego, it helps for you to think. I like the way that, it goes in depth about how the ego sometimes comes about and cloaks its argument internally. But it helps you, again, to say this first to yourself, because you can't give what you don't care. If you've never enjoined yourself to truth, enjoined yourself to patience, then you can't go into a group and enjoin that group to truth, enjoin that group to patience. So this coming theme will be about that group. Now, if we looked again through the prophets and messengers, Noah was not able to have a group that enjoins each other truth and patience, because it's a difficult task. It requires the help, strength, and the facilitation by God, for God, and by God. It requires God to create the path, if you will, or facilitate the path. And if you look at other prophets, from Noah, from Moses, like I said, from Jesus, like Jesus upon him peace, he was not able to also get a group to come together. They all had that same group dynamics of manipulation, intimidation, but people around him, they absorbed that intimidation. They absorbed that manipulation. So they were here. And they were seeking, kind of like Shakespeare said, they were speaking to be at the top. That's why they, from an Islamic tradition perspective, they were seeking the top. So they did try to humiliate him and his mother, and, but humility will always repel arrogance. He did not become a sponge to that arrogance. He did not try to seek the top. He's trying to promote the truth, trying to promote faith, trying to promote, again, people not to absorb that dominant voice. But the people around him, they absorbed that dominant voice. And he was not able to bring people to enjoin each other truth, enjoin each other to patience. Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings, was able to do that. So this theme will reflect on a community that was enjoining each other to truth, enjoining each other to patience. We see through their interactions, they weren't walking on eggshells with each other. There was nonstop guidance, correction, growth, guidance, correction, growth. There was also resilience and resistance in centering God and the narrative and the words and the pleasure of God, not in the distortions of abusive power. And we saw how the heart, was brought to life. The community was brought to life, and it was able to bring other communities into life along with them. So this is where this theme will take. I will explore in that theme, and I will be focusing on that interaction of a group that had faith, that centered God's voice, and joined each other to truth, and joined each other to patience. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.